Namaste and welcome to Sustainable Narratives, a fireside with Eric Lonergan to discuss his book called Angrynomics. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that all of you watching this from all over the world are here. So a good evening, a good afternoon, and a good morning to you all. We have Eric Lonergan with us. Eric is a macro hedge fund manager. He has written extensively. He's an author. He has worked and written for the Financial Times, the Foreign Affairs, and the Economist. And his recent book just come out called Angrynomics. That is what we're here to talk about. It's a pertinent book. And so Eric, welcome to Sustainable Narratives.
Thank you, Sachin. Pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. So what I want to do is, just contextualize this a little bit. So we've had, I believe, the conference has had 2 panel discussions already, one on governance, one on religion, and then a couple of firesides on nationalism and postmodernism. And so I suppose this comes into the realm of economics, but also, Eric, your book is interesting because having just finished dialogue 4 of your book, what I found 2 things really, really interesting. And one is that it's incredibly accessible, right? You don't have to be an economist to read it. And 2 is it's not really even, it's about economics, but you actually go very much and talk about society as a whole. So these are some of the key themes that I would like to cover with you. But before we get into that, just tell me a little bit and tell the audience, what is a macro hedge fund manager? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so my day job it's macro investing, which is we don't invest in individual companies, but it is really doing sort of asset allocation. So taking a big picture view on where the stock market is going, the bond market, currency markets. And the most granular we would get to is maybe country level or sectoral level within those. So it's really aggregate kind of asset allocation decision making, which, when I started out, I assumed markets were about economics, and it took me a while to learn that they're really about social psychology.
And that in itself is a fantastic segue into the book, isn't it? Because it's called Angrynomics, right? So 2 things I'm going to ask you straight away. Look, firstly, what is the book about? But actually, what is Angrynomics?
Right. Well, I think hopefully, and I'm very pleased that you found the book accessible, because this was really a key objective of mine and my co-author, Mark Blythe, who's a professor at Brown University in the US. We wanted it to be accessible on multiple levels. One is in terms of its style. So it's a conversation, a set of dialogues, and then kind of populated with these little stories about people who we've met or certain things that we've witnessed. And also in terms of the subject matter. So originally we'd written a book about what's happening in global politics and economics and how the 2 are interacting. And at a certain point, Mark said to me, he said, what about anger? And it really just got us thinking how anger is something we all observe. We almost take for granted. Children know what anger is. And yet I found myself, and people I've spoken to since, very inarticulate about anger. So if you said to me, why do humans get angry? Like, what function does it serve? What types of anger are there? Is anger good? Is anger bad? What should we do about anger? All of a sudden we realize, wow, this is a really, really interesting subject. And that's really the nub of the book. That's what it's really about. It's about trying to understand the different forms that anger takes, what it tells us about our society, and then using it as a lens to make sense of what's otherwise a very confusing political and economic environment.
And that's interesting. So you're using almost very much a human, emotional, psychological segue or a gateway to go and approach economics.
Exactly right.
How fascinating, because that's what's been unique about reading this, right? It's not a book on economics that then deals with anger. You're dealing with psychology of groups and individuals, because you tackle both, but then you're looking at it, and then you look at economics, right? So
Exactly
that's kind of
right.
And the second thing is, why did you do a dialogue? I mean, it's kind of very classical, isn't it? I mean, I'm a student of philosophy, and so when you read classical texts, it's always dialogue, but you definitely don't see that these days, and especially not from economists, right? So what was that about?
Well, it was really interesting because the reason we did it as a dialogue is a really practical reason. First of all, Mark and I really enjoyed discussing and arguing, and we thought, let's write a book together. And then we thought, well, it's going to be, we don't agree on everything. There are substantive disagreements and areas of nuance. And so then we thought, well, why don't we do it? Why don't we just record and transcribe our discussions? So, and that way it'll also have a bit of pace to it, because you can interrupt them and say, what exactly do you mean by that? Can you just go back a step and explain it more? Or what about this argument? And so that really appealed to us. And then when we approached publishers, the publishers didn't like it at all. We got
not surprised.
Publishers are very conservative. That's right. They say, no, it has to be a normal book. You know, this reads like a magazine. And that just made me more determined, because I thought, well, people find it easier to read magazines than books. So if this is more accessible and a bit different, that's not a bad thing. No, so we stuck to our guns with it. And I hope you found the dialogues interesting.
Yes, well, in fact, that's what we're going to kind of dig into, right? So let's kind of jump into it a little bit. So firstly, for all of you watching this, you know, the way in which the book is structured is that it's structured in a very classical way. For those of you who are students of philosophy or the classics, you have dialogue 1 to dialogue 4, and then there is each dialogue takes on a certain macro theme, and the discussion happens between, as Eric mentioned, Eric and Mark Blythe, who's a professor at Brown University, as we mentioned. And really, it feels like you're kind of eavesdropping on a Zoom conversation between the two of you, right? It's because you even show your differences off, right? And there are differences between you guys. It's not a sort of set stream of thought. You can see there are two streams here, albeit overlapping, but there is a difference, and you can sense that. So I thought that was very, very engaging, actually, and it kept my interest. So some of the things that I kind of want to sort of jump into, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Within this notion of anger, so let's deal with anger first, and then we'll sort of maybe flow into the economics, right? You talk about two types of anger. You say that there is group anger, and there's legitimate group anger, and there's cynical sort of anger. And the same way, then you said there's individual anger, which is kind of far more unwholesome, if I can put it that way. Do you just want to kind of elaborate on this?
Sure. So there were really two sets of distinctions that were critical in terms of the structure of the book within the concept of anger. So the first thing we identified is when we decided to look into anger and really explore it, we discovered a huge amount of literature covering lots and lots of disciplines. So there's work on anger in neuroscience and social psychology, philosophy, political science on voting behavior of angry people. And then, of course, there's all this sort of self-help on, you know, anger management, all these other issues. So, but what was lacking was any kind of synthesis, right? So again, all of this analysis across these disciplines kind of assumes we know what anger is. And the only unifying type actually is in moral philosophy and dates back to Aristotle. And this is the idea that anger is an appropriate response to an injustice. Yeah. This is the type of anger I think that people are most familiar with. So it's understandable that people are getting angry. Take live example, Black Lives Matter. It's understandable that people are getting angry because of police brutality, which they can literally see an appalling injustice in front of them. And one response to that is anger. And Aristotle would actually have argued that that's an appropriate response. And even interestingly, if you listen to Cornel West, I think he's a professor at Princeton, he was on CNN, a very interesting interview. And he was being asked about, you know, the protests. And he made exactly that argument. He said, what would it say about our society if people weren't protesting? Right? So this is the first type of anger, which is effectively moral outrage or a reaction to an injustice. And it has this property that you provide reasons, it's coherent, it sort of kind of makes sense. And at some level, it's an appropriate response.
Okay, and just on that, I mean, I almost feel you should have had a evolutionary psychologist co-authoring this with you guys as well, right? Almost. I mean, which we'll come on to a bit later on. But you talk about Aristotle and sort of, it's a moral outrage. So the first element is what's happening in the world today is some sense moral outrage.
Yeah.
Being a bit cynical, and this is what I felt, we see, human beings behaving pretty poorly, right? Like every day, if you look, right?
Yeah.
If you look, and then if you study the kind of statistics, right? And Steven Pinker does it best, right? In terms of some of his writings, where he talks about, we feel that there's a moral outrage in the world, but actually, at least in the developed world, the developed West, we've kind of never had it so good. And even in America, when you study the statistics, police brutality is less and less and less. People dying in custody is diminishing rapidly. Yes, I agree that the first type of anger is moral outrage, which is absolutely an appropriate Aristotelian response. But is that what's going on here? Would have been my first question. Is this some sort of manipulation that's going on?
Okay, so that's a really great question. There's a couple of different interesting dimensions going on. So there's kind of two ways to travel here. We can look at the other types of anger, so what we did next is this idea of moral outrage made a lot of sense to me because I studied moral philosophy when I did my first degree with economics, and so this made an awful lot of sense to me, and it was very present in a lot of literature. So if you look at neuroscience, it's kind of confirmed. Aristotle's theories. There's a lot of the research, the sort of scientific research in this area confirms this as a kind of brain reaction. But then we did a big data search, and we searched through using IBM's Watson Analytics. We searched hundreds of thousands of news stories, and got the system just to sort the stories by anger into different types. And this was a key moment for us. Was the second most frequent type of story about anger involved angry sports fans. Now, this to me was a real light bulb moment because I suddenly thought, that's totally obvious, right? You say that to me and you go, did you really need to, a big data analysis? That's like blindingly obvious. But it's also very perplexing.
It's a whole game to know that.
Yeah, well, exactly. You just need, you go to any football match and you'll see them. There's a small minority, almost always men, who are really, really angry. But that's perplexing because these football fans will travel, in appalling weather to the deepest, darkest parts of the country to watch a really bad game of football and get angry. And they pay good money to do this, right? So what function do they serve and what's going on there? And that's where we realized, and interestingly, in the research in social psychology, groups come up and group violence comes up, and often around sporting events. And to me, the key insight, I started going to football matches and watching the behavior of fans. And the key insight is they're not just antagonistic towards the other team. They're antagonistic towards their own players and their own group for lack of loyalty. So very often the anger and the rage is aimed at their own football team for not insufficient commitment. And this is when I realized, partly being an economist and thinking in terms of evolution, is that the function of this type of anger, which we call the sort of anger of devils, as it were, where on what is to regulate identity and to force people to ally themselves with a group. So we have these two very interesting and opposite sides to anger. We have the anger of angels, which kind of is a reaction to injustice, and the anger of devils, which says, I want you to be tribal, and tribalism is a precursor to violence.
Right. And that's what I was getting at when I said, is it really a moral outrage of what we're seeing? But actually what you're saying is maybe a moral outrage triggered a tribal outrage. It can happen. That's what could be going on around the world.
For sure. I mean, I think, the other question that you raised, which is a very interesting one, is this idea of, extraordinary human progress, and yet there seems to be a high level of discontent. And I think, that the truth of the matter is humans are hardwired to progress. So, it's not a great survival strategy to rest on your laurels. And so I think to some extent that is the nature of human progress, which is why the anger will never go away, anger at injustice, the need to improve and better ourselves. And that's why, in a sense, I listen to Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter. I think those calls for action of an ethical sort need to be responded to. Concerns about wealth inequality, because we can do an awful lot better. However, I think we have to be incredibly careful about the anger of devils and the promoting of nationalism, blaming others for our problems, this propensity to create groups and tribes.
Right, because we just, I mean, I just want to pick something up. You said that. You said something very interesting. You said, absolutely, you want to be very conscious and very listening. I mean, if you're in any sort of responsible position, you want to be listening to moral outrage, right? Absolutely, because it's telling you something about your society. Yeah. But at the same time, there's the outrage of devils, which I think is very appropriate sort of framing, actually. Two things. How do you distinguish between the two?
Okay.
One. Two is, what role is economics playing in this sort of tribalism?
Okay.
Right? Especially, I'm thinking about the developed West for now, right?
Yeah. I mean, great questions, right? So the way you distinguish, and this is something that has actually come up in a lot of conversations about the book. So there's a kind of sense that, the people you agree with, you're saying is the moral outrage. The people you disagree with, you're saying is the tribal rage, right? That's not true. So you can have moral outrage and be wrong ethically, right? So just because you're outraged doesn't mean you have the right side of an ethical argument. However, and this is something I learned from studying moral philosophy, is the answer is in the reasons that people give for their anger. Okay? And what I mean, so in other words, one is cognitive in a very clear way. If you stop an Extinction Rebellion protester, right, somebody who says, we have to take action because we're destroying our planet, you and I both know the types of reasons and arguments they will give us. So if I stop one and say, why are you so angry? They're going to say, well, first of all, they're going to say, you should be angry too, because our environment's being destroyed, our streams are being polluted, our air is being destroyed, our cities are being destroyed, future generations are being ignored. Look what's happening in many parts of the world where people are being impoverished by climate change. You should be angry, right? It is, and they provide coherent reasons. You may disagree with them. You may say, well, I don't think it's being caused by that, but there's a set of reasons that are ethical by nature. They refer to the interests and consequences.
Yeah.
Now, if you go to a football match and it's a London derby or whoever's playing, whether it's, I don't know, American football, cricket, soccer, it doesn't matter what you're playing. You stop one of the fans and you say, why are you shouting at your players? They're more likely to hit you. Right. So the point is that whose side are you on?
Experience.
Right. It's just about whose side are you on. Right. Those are very, very different forms of reason and behavior. Now, when it comes, just because somebody is exhibiting moral outrage, of course, doesn't mean they can't be wrong. Right. I mean, ethical questions are not contested by an emotional reaction. Ultimately, we have an argument and a discussion. Yeah. But that's a very, very different response. Right. So if you see somebody on the street who's hitting a child, and your instinct is you get angry, you say, stop that. And there's a sense of if you don't stop that, we're going to stop you. That's moral outrage. That's a very different reaction to somebody saying, come on, we're going to go and fight them, and you better get in line with me. Those are very different phenomena.
Right. Okay. No, I understood. The other thing I want to touch on here is sort of, I want to take, because I think your book, you guys talk about sort of 1920s, post-Great Depression. You guys talk about Keynesian economics, right? You kind of flow in history as well in your conversation, actually, which contextualizes how on earth we got to this position today, right? So some of the things I want to pick up is around this moral outrage bit, right? And you guys pick on this notion of, look, I mean, the truth be told, over the last 2 decades, the common man or woman in the UK or in the US has barely had a pay rise, right? Wages on the whole, have been pretty flat, creeping upwards when you consider inflation. Whereas when you then look at the developed world, they've been tripling, doubling wealth every 5-6 years, and it's been boom time. And then you've got sort of, 10 years of austerity in this country, right? And there is a growing sense, rightly or wrongly, or accurately or inaccurately, that there is a growing inequality amongst those who have and those who have not, right? And that gap is getting bigger. And you guys pick on this quite a little bit. And what I want to do is, Eric, if you could kind of flow us through how our economy has sort of the models in which we've used from, say, post-World War to today. What's the journey we've been going on? Just contextualize it for us.
So effectively, I think the way we like to think about it is you can think of an economy as being hardware, and then changes, or the capitalist system, if you want to say, is the hardware that we have. Like the free market capitalism is our hardware. And then periodically over the last century or so, we've changed the software, right? So if you go pre-Second World War, you had kind of unregulated, very small state, free market capitalism as a gross simplification, which then came crashing down with the Great Depression. Right? So that was the hardware crash. And you get an angry response, right? This, in a sense, is the Angrynomics. Whenever the system crashes, you get a response.
In Europe, it caused a terrific problem. I mean, we know what happened.
For sure. So you get, so the system crashed. Now then the software was Keynesianism, which really just meant you had a greater state involvement. Obviously, part of the Western world went communist. But if we take the other side of the world, you effectively had a change in the software, which was this mixed economy. You create a welfare state, you have greater government involvement, you have fiscal policy, which actively tries to pursue full employment. So, and then you had a system that worked very, very well until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, you had a different form of crash in the system, which was stagflation, which was high unemployment and high inflation. And you had militant trade unions, lots of other issues, right? And effectively, the reaction there was another set of software was introduced, which was the kind of Friedmanite, Thatcherite, Reagan, which was about deregulation, privatizing state-owned industries, deregulating labor and product markets, increasing the rate of competition, ultimately handing over the power of monetary policy to independent central banks. And effectively, we ended up with the system we have currently, which is, broadly speaking, has been called neoliberalism. But what you can just describe it as a form of, it's an evolution of this mixed economy, because we still have significant degrees of state involvement, but to a lesser extent than you did in the 60s and 70s. Now, that system crashed in the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and the Euro crisis, 2012, 13. But we never really changed the software. That's our point. And what we're saying is,
what did we do?
Well, we changed the software a little bit, right? Yeah. Well, what we did do is we certainly sorted out the banks, I would say. So we made a huge reform of the banking system. But in a sense, the anger or the discontent that was revealed by the financial crisis, I think, has had three components to it. One is about environmental sustainability, right? So the broad population, the silent majority and the less silent minorities are saying, this is we cannot keep our system going like this, right? Scientific evidence is overwhelming. We have to take action. And frankly, none of the political class during the era of neoliberalism, still to this day, has got a serious plan to deal with the environment. So that's kind of moral outrage number one. The other is that people started to say, look, 90% of our wealth is in the hands of 1 to 5% of our populations. Can't we do better than that? Right? You don't have to be an egalitarian or a communist. You're just saying, surely we can do better than that, right? If you could distribute 20% of that to 80% of the population, you would make people's lives a great deal better off. And the problem with these concentrations of wealth is you're getting political interference, political corruption, all of these other sort of social and political consequences. And then the third thing is we get recessions. Right? And the recession still plagues, in a sense, the free market capitalist system. Right? And why haven't we got a way of either preventing recessions or making them less harmful. And that's kind of, so that's where the book gives you this kind of summary of the history of recent history of capitalism, observes that anger, when the system crashes, you need a new software. And that this time around, we haven't really created a software to address those fundamental problems. And that's what we try to do in the kind of final third of the book.
Before we get to your solutions, I think your solutions are rather interesting. Why have our institutions not been able to, I mean, you talk about the banks. Now, I work in private equity, and I can definitely vouch. Banks are more tighter, more stricter, more prudent, far more capitalized. You know, the leverage levels are much lower than they've ever been, right? As far as in my lifetime. So I totally get that. But there's something about the system that hasn't been fixed. Why? What prevented us? Okay. Was it political will? Was it that the people were just kind of, hoodwinked out of it and distracted with something else? What happened?
I mean, that's a great question. So I think it's partly a failure of ideas. So there was no upgrade off the shelf. There was
tragic.
We didn't have 4.0 that we could just take off the shelf and say, let's use this software. So we didn't have an equivalent of Keynes. We didn't have equivalent, you might say, kind of Marx if you'd gone communist. You didn't have a version, you didn't have Keynes, you didn't have Friedman. So the center, there was no obvious set of ideas. And to be honest, you and I would agree on this, fixing the banks doesn't change most people's lives, right? People wouldn't even know that. It's almost a technical issue that economists have dealt with. Now, the other thing is that because there was nothing obvious off the shelf, the political class still needs to win elections. So they didn't campaign on big ideas. They decided to go nationalist. So this is a very important factor to me. When I think about politics as an economist, I'm always interested in their incentives. Always ask yourself, they have to get elected, how are they going to do it? And if you listen to Viktor Orban in Hungary, he's the clearest of the populists, right? Because he's totally explicit about his strategy. He pretty much says, liberalism, free markets won't get me elected. Right? What will get me elected is nationalism, putting Hungary first, tribalism, actually illiberalism, attacking the EU. That gets people out to vote. So what's happened is our political class combined with the media are absolutely incentivized to go tribal. You see it with Trump, right? He wants to turn.
Why is the media incentivized? Sorry, I get the political class.
Okay.
Why
well, the media, because the media has changed economically. Its economic conditions have shifted. And the media used to be oligopolies and monopolies, right? If you lived in Britain, you had the BBC and you had maybe a couple of other channels, but effectively everybody would get around and listen to the news, or you chose one of 3 or 4 newspapers. The problem is that, so they had a captive audience. Journalism and media was in a sense a pulpit of sorts. You preached, the newspaper would preach an ideology or a perspective to its audience. We live in a completely different world now. You have to fight for eyeballs because it's a hugely competitive environment. And so that is a complete change. And I think as a result of that, you have this kind of alignment of incentives between both the media and the political class to create tribalism and enrage tribalism.
And also our algorithms, right, in all of these platforms also seem to be geared towards that way. And I suppose they're just responding to human pangs or human desires in that sense, right? With connecting with like-minded anger and then grouping together online and off they go, right? I mean, how many protests have we seen that were all organized via Facebook or something?
Well, you can see this, if you analyze any online traffic, if you're running a blog or you're doing a webcast or you're doing any type of activity, there's a reason why the media will focus on immigration or focus on nationalism. It generates traffic. If you make these group identity-based arguments, people get very heated. The other very important point here is that angry people are more likely to vote. This is statistically. And elections are being won by minorities, right? Because most countries are pretty evenly divided, right? So if you look at America, Trump won with 80,000 votes. 80,000, right? That's a fraction of a percent of the population. Nothing, right? So if you can get those angry people riled up and get them to vote, you can win.
Well, Brexit was something similar, right?
Absolutely. Even Brexit, even the fact the turnout is high and you get a material majority, it's still a tiny fraction. You're talking 2-3% of the less than that of the electorate and of those that turned out.
And what's interesting, therefore, is you're literally saying that our liberal democracies, in some sense, is shaking. Like our liberal democracies right now, by the 2-3%, if they can be riled up in a particular direction, they can shape the trajectory of the country for the next 5-6 years.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing one has to remember is that tribalism is zero sum, right? It's not, whereas ultimately economics, trade, right? If you and I cooperate, it's positive sum, right? If you and I living on our islands is zero sum. If you and I get together and start to trade, because you're different to me and you have different things and different skills and the division of labor, we actually all get better. I mean, people still don't understand this point ultimately about economics is the pie does get bigger. We become more productive, right?
Absolutely.
The problem with tribalism is it's zero sum. It's premised on the idea that there's scarce resources. So I have to fight you for them.
Absolutely. No, and I think that point's there. And I want to move to this particular point because I want to get to your solution. Is that for once, and there's two things here. One thing I found refreshing about the book, especially your last dialogue, is that, I think it's a massive failure, isn't it, of our intelligentsia, our academia, our thinkers, to not have come out with a software mechanism that is practical, reasonable, and as you said, that would have genuinely taken us to the next level, right?
That's right.
And instead we've ended up patching it up, which has led to all of these problems.
That's
now, you guys came out with a solution. So talk to me a little bit about what this economic solution might be, which allows us to move away from tribalism, nationalism in that ethnic narrow sense, and allows us to cooperate and trade and, tell us about that solution.
Okay. Well, the first thing that's key for me is we want to go for the anger of angels, right? We want to listen to the Greta Thunbergs, the Extinction Rebellion. We want to provide people with a motivating set of ideas that will change their society for the better. So it has to do two things. It has to be, to motivate people, it has to be relatively simple, right? It has to genuinely have an impact. And ideally, in my view, it should not be partisan.
Right. So universal.
Right? Exactly. We want it to be closer to being a self-evident truth, right? Where most people can get behind it. And I think if we can do that, we can really challenge the politics of tribalism, right? So we need an ideology that is genuinely more universal and aimed at making us all better off. And I think there are policies that there's a consensus is starting to emerge, right? Because the first important thing is that I think there's overwhelming agreement to do something about the environment, to do something about wealth inequality, and to do something about recessions. They're kind of self-evident truths. Nobody really is opposed to that. But what's lacking is, where are the three big ideas that I can understand, that make me optimistic, right? The problem if you take the environment, most people go, oh my God, we don't stand a chance. It's just too hard.
It's hugely depressing.
Exactly. Whereas I want to make it out to be positive sum, not zero sum. I want it to be, we can do this. We can have a huge impact within 5 years. As a result of it, we'll all be better off, right? We will be materially better off. And over 10 years, we can solve it. And as a result, we will have higher rates of productivity, better cities, better quality air, and a much happier, well-balanced, both regionally in terms of our growth and development, but globally in terms of growth and development.
You, sir, are describing a utopia. Now you tell me how we're going to get there. Tell me your solution.
Okay, so the first thing is we are by some distance the luckiest generation that's ever existed, and not for, in part because of the reasons that Steven Pinker provides, but also for something that people perceive to be a problem, which is the fact that we have interest rates at zero across the developed world. Now,
okay, so
why does that make us,
I found this fascinating. Tell me.
Okay, so why does this make us the luckiest generation ever? Well, the problem of sustainable economic development, ultimately zero carbon emissions or shrinking the quantity of carbon emissions dramatically, requires capital investment. Okay, so Europe needs to, the world needs to replace all of its energy infrastructure with sustainable energy. Okay, that's a capital requirement. Now, if I can borrow at negative real interest rates, and I apologize to the audience in advance that I'm going to use some mathematics, but I'll just use it very, very little, right? Let's call it a zero interest rate for simplicity. I can borrow at zero nominal interest rates for 20 years. If the UK government were today issue a zero coupon for 20 years, so it pays no interest rate and just repays the principal in 20 years' time, it can make any investment that it makes in the energy sector with a positive return. All it needs is a positive, 1% positive return, creates value for the state today. The state's balance sheet is stronger. The equity capital of the state has gone up. Right? Now, you understand this. This is basic financial arithmetic. Financial arithmetic tells us any investment is worth doing if our return is higher than our cost of capital. So this is an extraordinary opportunity. Okay, and that is clearly solely a failure of the mind.
Because interest rates are so low and you perceive that they will be low, right, for the foreseeable future.
Well, you can issue for 20 years. I don't even need them to be, I don't care if they're low in the future. If I fund myself today.
So why on earth did we just go through 10 years of austerity?
Well, so there's an interesting question in a sense, but first of all, this point is a really important point to drive home, this is just a fact of mathematics, right? This is just compound interest. So the way people can understand it is, if you imagine you buy a house and you get a mortgage at a zero interest rate and no capital repayment until the end of the term. And you take out and you get a 20-year mortgage and you just have to repay it in 20 years' time with no interest. And you take in a lodger who pays you, or a tenant, and they pay you a 5% rental yield, right? Within 12 years, 13 years, you will be able to repay the mortgage, okay? And you have the full value of the property, right? And that is that is effectively the opportunity that we have here. Bear in mind as well, the government controls the price of electricity, right? Electricity prices are regulated. They can choose whatever return on capital they want. So not only that, if you think, well, how long does it take? Well, I mean, you can build wind farms in 18 months, right? I mean, we do not need decades. Right? This is absolutely a failure of the mind. And you can apply exactly the same logic to saying, we need to be ambitious. And we need to use our balance sheet clever. I'm not saying that the state needs to do it all, but we can effectively use the state's cost of funding to tackle these issues.
How interesting. So okay. So two questions to you then. One is, why isn't anybody doing this?
Right.
Right. And two is in a nutshell, you talk about some of the other models around, you mentioned a fund, right? An investment fund, which a sovereign sort of type fund.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that bit as well on your books? I think that's quite.
I mean, why people aren't doing this, I mean, this is a classic thing. It's because once they do it, the question will be, why aren't you doing it? Right? It's one of those things where it's very interesting because, I come from Ireland originally, and I've been talking to Irish policymakers, and I can tell they want somebody else to do it first.
It's risky, right? It's
risky.
Right. Everybody wants somebody else.
Human beings, the biggest risk as a human being is looking stupid, right? And they don't want to do something and then look foolish, right? So, but it's one of those things. I think part of the reason we haven't done it before is we haven't had these low interest rates before.
Okay.
And it was plausible to try and argue they were temporary. Now they look to be enduring. The sovereign wealth fund idea is not dissimilar. Again, it's exploiting where the cost of debt is. And all I'm observing there is capital investment by the state and the private sector does take time. You need planning permission. You have setup costs. It's time consuming. How about tackling inequality like this? Let's set up national wealth funds. And you'll be familiar with the idea of sovereign wealth funds like Singapore and Norway. And what we can learn from them is over the long term, by which I mean 10 or 20 years, they have typically averaged returns at about 6% nominal, right? So they're able to compound at something like a 6% return. My argument is, why doesn't the developed world, given where its interest rate structures are, issue for 10 or 20 years and effectively set up a fund which they would then put out to tender to a series of asset managers and say, we want you on a 15, 20-year view, you're to generate us a 4 to 6% return. We can live with the volatility. We just want a diversified global portfolio, generate 4 to 6% return. Within 15 years, you can repay the debt and you've got the assets. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, then what I'm saying is you've created a national pool of wealth, and you could give ownership or stakes in that wealth fund to those parts of the population who don't have any stake. And the beauty of this is you could do this within 3 to 6 months, and you could give people ownership within a year. Right? So you could go to 80% of the population who doesn't have assets and say, you now have a stake in our national wealth fund. You can't draw it down immediately. We're not throwing money at people, but you now have a share in global capital. So if the system grows and the system generates returns, you will benefit from it. And you'll have something that will contribute either to a pension, you could use it for education, you could use it for housing, you could use it for health. You have a stake. And
Wonderful.
national inheritance.
Yes, and you know, I'm just conscious of time, and we've already consumed 45 minutes just like that, right? And we've just scratched the surface. I know, I know this. Look, the beautiful thing is firstly, thank you so much, Eric, for taking the time this evening to speak to our audience. You know, we've had a wonderful response to the entire conference, and there are people viewing from all over the world, from all over different backgrounds, and I'm sure lots of people will be viewing this conversation for weeks, months to come. So that's pretty good. Everybody that has joined us this evening or this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in the world, I want to thank you. I hope you found that very, very interesting. Eric will be joining me tomorrow on another panel, another VM panel called Creating Wealth Sustainably. So that's tomorrow at 6 p.m. And as you'll be seeing on your screen, tomorrow we have a fantastic day at this conference, again, starting at 1 p.m. BST, looking at the relationship between big states and small states. And that's with Abhijit Iyer Mitra. At 3 o'clock, we have something called sustainable ethics. In fact, that will probably have some overlap to kind of thing that Eric was talking about earlier. I want to talk about moral philosophy and moral outrage. And then at 4:15, one not to be missed, we have a expert witness who will talk to us about women and Islam. So it's a fantastic day tomorrow. Please do join us. And from everybody at Sustainable Narratives and myself, Sachin Nanda, thank you very much. Namaste.